Welcome to A Date with Darkness podcast, where I will be discussing the impact of hurtful and abusive relationships and how to overcome them so that you can move through your pain and get to the kind of healthy relationships you want, need, and deserve. I'm Dr. Natalie Jones. I'm a licensed psychotherapist based in California. While I hope that you find this podcast educational and informational, please note it should not be substituted for treatment with a licensed mental health professional. Also, due to the nature of the podcast, some of the information presented on the show can be sensitive to some of my listeners, so please note that listener discretion is advised. Hello, and welcome back to A Date with Darkness. Super excited to have you here, and I have a special guest planned for you guys today. Today's guest is Coach Laura Connell, and Laura and I are going to be talking about dysfunctional families and the 5 types or typologies of dysfunctional family members. And this is something that's near and dear to my heart, and something which I wrote about in my graduate thesis. So it brings back memories, and I have to sit there and think about some of the themes and things like that I wrote about. And it's interesting because I feel like every now and then these themes or these typologies of different family members, they sort of evolve into different names. So it's interesting to watch the evolution over time. And so without further ado, here's my interview with Laura Connell. Hello and welcome to the show, Laura.
Hi, Dr. Natalie. I'm really happy to be here. Thanks for having me.
I am excited to have you on. So for my listeners who may not know you, can you tell us a little bit about who you are and what you do and the passion behind your work?
Sure. So I'm a trauma-informed author and coach, and the author part is fairly well established. I've been writing my whole life, and I've always written about nonfiction, self-oriented kind of stuff, very insightful, opinionated kind of things about human nature and society and culture. And it's just in the last couple of years, since 2020, I started to write more about my dysfunctional family, my childhood trauma. And I think that was just an effect of COVID kind of, restricting me to my home, giving me an opportunity to think about what do I really want. And I realized what I wanted was to be authentic, and I wanted to be able to talk about things that I had frankly been hiding. I thought of myself as an honest person, but I had been hiding this really foundational aspect of my life, which was my childhood trauma. And so I decided to just open up about that. And I started with my blog, which was already established, but I started getting more personal there. And then that wound up on Instagram. So I'd take my blog and I'd kind of bring it over to Instagram. And that's where the community really got created. And so a lot of people resonated with what I was seeing. And they say it helps them feel less alone, but it really did exactly the same thing for me, and it continues to do that. And then the coaching part came out of requests. So on my Instagram and on my email, people would be asking me if I would coach them. And I would always say, I'm not a coach, I'm a writer. I coach through my words. I use the written word to help people and to help myself. And then finally, I got an email from a woman that I just couldn't say no to, because she was like me 10 years ago. It was like myself 10 years ago asking for help, and I just couldn't say no. So I had already trained as a coach, funny enough, because I have a book coming out next year. I have a publisher, and the book is a self-help book on the topics that I write about. It's called It's Not Your Fault. And the subtitle is Subconscious Reasons We Self-Sabotage and How to Stop. And to me, those reasons are mainly in childhood. And so in order to have more credibility as a self-help author, I got the coaching credential. And so I was qualified to coach. And so I decided, okay, let's do it. And I found it extremely rewarding. And the people I started working with had great feedback for me. So it's kind of just gone from there. So that's a bit about me.
Yeah, and the dysfunctional family that you were talking about, is it your current family or is it your family of origin, or how would you describe the family dysfunction that you're dealing with?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I was lucky enough to be born into a dysfunctional family and then to marry into a dysfunctional family. So I kind of got it on both ends. And of course, growing up in the dysfunction kind of primed me to find more dysfunction. I'm sure you know how that
Mhm.
goes.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So in my family of origin, there was a great amount of emotional abuse and neglect. It wasn't so much physical, it was emotional. And I'm a Gen X, so I grew up at a time when we didn't even really acknowledge emotional abuse. Abuse
Mm,
meant that you were getting beaten, right? And
mhm,
even back then, even hitting was really not considered a bad thing. If you didn't
mm,
hit your kids, there was something weird about you,
yeah,
right?
yeah.
So, my mother had an undiagnosed mental illness. And of course, that stems from her own childhood trauma. And then my father was just very emotionally neglectful. You know, he was there physically, but that was really it. And it was almost like living with a ghost. He just wasn't there in any way that would fulfill any needs that I had as a child. So I had the abuse on one side from my mother and then the neglect on the other side from my father. And that's sort of what I grew up with.
Mm. You mentioned something a moment ago which struck me. You said that you felt like you were being honest, but what you discovered about yourself is that you were hiding. And I think that stands out because that's actually something that happens quite a bit, that people that come from dysfunctional or traumatic backgrounds, that happens with them, where you hide yourself or you become invisible, right? You learn that over time, that you're not really seen or validated or asked to be seen or validated, and so you learn to hide yourself in your feelings. Can you talk a little bit more about that process for you?
Yes. And I would add to that that you can also be punished for being seen or for telling
Mhm.
the truth. And as
Mm.
someone who came to inhabit what we call the scapegoat role in the
Yes.
family, I was punished usually for telling the truth and
Mm.
for kind of just, I guess as they would see it, threatening to expose what was going on in the family. And I think a lot of it is subconscious on their part.
Mm.
So for me, I had a very real fear of a backlash from my family, which I'd already experienced a little bit, even with the tiny ways that I had tried to be vocal about
Mhm.
what was going on with me and why, which was related to the trauma I had experienced. And so I think for me, the visibility part felt dangerous, to be vocal about what
Mm.
was going on in my family and what I'd endured felt like I was putting myself in the line of fire. And I
Mm.
even played with having a pen name, an alias, because I was that scared of just telling the truth, really. But finally, my desire for authenticity won out. I just thought to myself, I'm at an age now where I'm at the second half of my life. I've lived longer than I have left. And how do I want the rest of my life to look? Do I want to
Mhm.
keep hiding other people's secrets or do I want to be fully myself? And I finally decided it was worth the risk.
Can you talk about the ways in which hiding shows up in your life, other than, maybe even wanting to hide your own work and under a pen name? Can you talk about some of the ways in which you began to notice that you were hiding parts of yourself?
Yes, absolutely. I think this began for me in childhood where I would do things like deny myself opportunities,
Mm.
such as this one, something similar to this, where I'm invited on a big podcast
Mm.
to talk about, something that's important to me. That feels very scary. It feels scary still,
Mm.
but when I was younger, I would just say no. forget about looking for the opportunity. If it came to me, I would just say no because it just felt too scary. At work, I would not seek out, what's the word, promotions. At meetings, I would not speak up. I had great ideas, but I would keep them to myself. Often I would find other people taking my ideas because I would maybe kind of just tell one person who wasn't trustworthy instead of speaking up to the boss. I would be afraid to even walk into the boss's office, things like that. So these are the ways that hiding can really hold us back in very real ways, because that impacts my career, that impacts my finances. So that's just, one example of how that showed up for me.
Yeah. And it sounds like it also impacted your ability to connect and also take a chance on yourself.
Yes,
Mhm.
absolutely. I was so much in survival mode because of what happened to me that I didn't realize I was in survival mode. I only know this because of all the research I've done since on what the survival brain is like compared to the
Mhm.
healthy brain and things like that. But I was just constantly trying to keep myself safe from harm. And when you're in that state of mind, you're just not on your own side. You're not doing things that are going to help you. You're kind of just keeping your head above water, right?
Yes. What was your light bulb moment um, where you started to begin to realize that you were hiding yourself? What was it that really struck out in your mind and said, you know what, wait a minute. Why am I shrinking myself and making myself small or invisible?
Yeah, I can't honestly think of a light bulb moment. It
Mm,
has been a very long journey that continues. I'm not
mhm,
there yet. I'm still on the journey. But I would say a key moment that helped me start telling the truth about, how I was being inauthentic and really not telling the truth about myself or my life was that I had been using alcohol to numb my pain essentially since
mhm,
I was in my teens. And this was a habit that kind of ebbed and flowed depending on what was going on in my life. So sometimes it would be really intense. I'd be binge drinking every weekend. And then there'd be years where I was okay, like I was using alcohol kind of like a normal person, but not, heavily addicted to it. But as I got further into my marriage and as the children started to come, I have two children who are now grown. And when my second child came around, the lack of support and the inauthenticity I was living in, it really took a toll, and my, alcohol abuse kind of escalated.
mm,
And so that, among, with a lot of other things, led to the end of my marriage. And after I left that marriage, or after the marriage ended, I finally got to deal with the alcohol problem. And so I think in recovery, the first thing I learned was that you have to be honest and you have to be humble. And at the time, those two things felt inaccessible to me, and I remember sitting in the meeting. It was when I was very early in recovery. It was a 12-step meeting. And I was reading this chapter, step one, we had to get completely honest with ourselves. And I went into a complete panic inside. And I remember looking around at other people at the table and thinking, are they hearing this? Like, I can't be honest with myself. I will die. Like, I really thought, I'm going to die if I have to be honest with myself. And humble, because at the time I was using grandiosity to kind of get by and prop
mhm,
myself up and things like that.
mhm.
So getting a handle on those two things really made the difference for me. So I suppose now that I'm saying it, you could say that was kind of the turning point.
Absolutely. And I would even, maybe take it a step further. Um, and I think what a lot of people from traumatic family backgrounds don't realize, especially if you're hiding, right? If you're hiding, for me, that means it's difficult to hold emotions. And when it's difficult to hold space for your own emotions or to know what to deal with it or how to manage your own emotions, you do turn to things like alcohol. People turn to things like alcohol, they turn to things like sex, they turn to things like shopping or spending money quickly as it comes in their hands as soon as they can get it, or doing incessant home construction projects or complete avoidance, anything that they can use to completely avoid or numb. And I always think of that as just like that's the way of which you avoid parts of yourself too, and like how you're feeling or what comes up for you when you remember things in the real world, that trauma, those triggers, and things like that.
Absolutely. The emotional piece was huge for me because I never learned to manage my emotions. My
Mm-hmm.
parents were so neglectful, and it was all about managing my mother's emotions because she was so
Mm,
dysregulated. And so I disconnected from my own, and my focus became all about how do I manage other people's emotions. But at the same time, we're human and those emotions have to come out. And so when you don't know how to manage them, they come out inappropriately. So when you drink and your defenses are down, all of a sudden you're having an outburst and everyone's like, what is the matter with her? Because this
yeah.
outburst is related to all the years of trauma, but it looks like you're overreacting to this little thing, right?
Mm-hmm.
So the emotional piece is huge, and learning how to regulate our emotions is a massive part of healing, definitely.
Mm. I would agree with you 100% there. Tell me about loneliness.
hmm Well, loneliness to me, for someone who's been through childhood trauma, if you grow up in a dysfunctional home, you can feel even more lonely around other people than you do when you're on your own.
Mm-hmm.
And that's why, you can have chronic loneliness. It's sort of this emptiness that never goes away. And it feels like it gets even worse when you're around other people. So you
Mm-hmm.
hear all this great advice to get out there and make friends, make connections, network. But when you're in the situation, because you've been primed to kind of abandon yourself and to focus on other people, you don't have the connection with yourself that's necessary to have a connection with others, right? So I would always go into a social situation definitely wearing a mask. I would not express my opinions. I would let people monopolize the conversation and always put myself in the listening mode. And so I left feeling very depleted.
Mm.
I didn't leave feeling like I'd made a connection. I left feeling like someone had taken something from me because I didn't have any boundaries. I didn't have a voice. I was so busy trying to hide the real me that nobody can connect with that. And the thing is, healthy people sense that you're lying to them, and I know that sounds harsh, but the truth is you are lying when you're not presenting your true self. And healthy people kind of sense, I can't trust this person. They're just telling me what I want to hear. And so that feeds into the I'm not lovable. See, I get rejected. And it's like a cycle that perpetuates itself. So if you're not, it is important to connect with other people. But if you're
Mm-hmm.
going into it with these maladaptive kind of coping mechanisms, then it's not going to help. You have to do it in the way where you are connected to yourself first.
Good. And I would agree with that. What for people that are listening to you, I think it's important to clarify what the difference is between alone versus lonely.
Yes,
Because
absolutely.
one of them has a little bit more pathology with it versus one of them is completely fine and healthy to a certain degree.
Yes, absolutely. And I think you could even call it solitude versus loneliness. I've heard
Mm,
it described that way too, which is really nice. And I think, we can kind of gauge with ourselves once you start to connect with yourself, that you can start to gauge when is it too much alone time.
mm,
Because if you are experiencing that disappointing lack of connection with other people, you might start to withdraw. And that's
Mm.
why a lot of childhood trauma sufferers, they can become isolated and they get the feeling like nobody understands me, nobody knows me, I'm all alone. And so having solitude or alone time is very healthy. And we know those people who can't be alone, and that's not healthy, right? But I think it's the reason why you're doing it and it's the degree to which you're doing it. So if you're constantly feeling like you'd rather be alone, I think that might be something to look into.
Okay. When you find yourself sort of unable to connect with people in life or social situations, how can people counteract that? How can they show up and be authentic or, have a conversation or be present with other people if they're sort of caught in this cycle of being being lonely or not or being not maybe lacking confidence around their ability to connect with others.
Yeah, absolutely. I would say one thing you can do is to express your thoughts and
Mm.
opinions in an appropriate way. You don't have to become super opinionated, but you can just say what you think about something, express how you feel. You can also offer information about yourself instead of waiting to be asked, because a lot of times people don't think to ask you. They assume that you're going to offer it, and they might even think, you know, they won't ask because maybe you don't want to tell. So just get used to offering information. And I would say if you find yourself constantly being sort of in the listening role, just try to take your turn. And at the same time, if you're with someone who really won't let you take your turn, move along. If you're in a social
Mm.
situation, you don't owe them your time. If you've tried to interject with your own thought or your turn sort of thing, and they're just monopolizing, then just kind of say, oh, I'm going to go get something to eat or whatever, and just sort of find someone else to talk to. You're allowed to do that.
Yeah, and I would even offer maybe even drawing parallels between yourself and what the other person is saying. So, like, share the commonalities and be vocal about sharing the commonalities. But I also think one of the bigger pieces for people that struggle with loneliness is a way to counteract that is to follow up, like maybe following up with a person and offering to connect with them outside of, a certain event or,
Mhm.
certain situations and maybe spend time getting to know each other better. So asking and exchanging information and following up.
I love that. Yeah, and that's a great way to get over the fear of intimacy that a lot of us have. A lot of us have trouble making true connections or true friendships because we're
Hmm.
just afraid of it. And by the same token, sometimes we can be inappropriate where we offer too much too soon.
Yes.
Like we start
Filling.
telling a stranger all about our trauma and
Yeah.
we expose ourselves and we flood the other person, and
Yes.
that can lead to more of the rejection that we fear. So it's a balance for sure.
Absolutely. Yeah. The spilling is, I definitely educate my clients about spilling too much too soon, and learning the process of discernment of when to share and who to share with and what's appropriate and what's not. So thank you for sharing that. Also, when it comes to dysfunctional families, you've talked, a bit about the dysfunctional roles in families. Can you tell us a little bit more about what those dysfunctional roles in families are and what they look like in real life?
Sure, absolutely. So I did mention that I inhabited the scapegoat role in my family.
Mm.
And I want to say that I also inhabited the hero role, which is another one I'll tell you about.
Mhm.
So we're not always stuck in one role. We can move in and out depending on kind of the needs of the family at the time, I guess.
Yeah.
The scapegoat is the one who's generally the truth teller. I compare it to a whistleblower in a corporation. So someone who wants to expose the truth, but the other people in the company or the family want to keep things as they are.
Yeah.
And so what they do is they demonize the truth teller, and they make it so that you're the crazy one. You're the one with the problem. We're all fine over here. If it weren't for you, everything would be fine. And that's sort of the role of the scapegoat. And that's how the scapegoat can keep the family system going. And another one is the hero that I mentioned. And just like it sounds, that's the person who is the high achiever, kind of does everything right. And their job is to present an image of perfection so that people look and say, wow, they must come from a good family. There can't be anything wrong with that family. Look what they've produced.
Yeah.
And another one is the mascot, and that would be the person in the family who diffuses tension through humor. So if you're at the dinner table and things start to get tense, they'll tell a joke or they'll act silly, diffuses the tension and prevents any conflict from arising. Then we have the enabler or the caretaker. And this could be a spouse or a child of someone who's addicted to something. So it could be a way of enabling them in their addiction. Or it could also just be the person who is kind of putting everybody else's needs ahead of their own, sort of the martyr. And that prevents anyone from dealing with their own problems. So they clean up everybody's mess. They make sure everything is taken care of. And their fear is really that if they don't do that, the family is going to fall apart and they're going to be alone. And the final one is the lost child. And that's the one who's kind of invisible, or, they've sort of detached from the family to avoid the conflict. They fly under the radar. They don't cause any fuss. And, they don't feel like they're really part of the family. They feel like they don't matter, and they have a deep need that's not being met, but they don't know how to express themselves. So that's kind of a rundown of the 5 that I look at anyway.
Yeah. And, it's interesting to sort of, look at maybe how these roles or how people in these roles would evolve over time. Right. And like just looking at them. And I want to say, I forget who came up with these roles originally, but I know, I want to say I did my dissertation on it. And I think Michelle Gagné and Bouchard were the ones who readapted it to give it the titles that you're now calling it, if my research mind remembers correctly. But also just thinking about how these roles adapt over time, especially with like the lonely child that's invisible. And I don't typically like to quote research on my show, but just for this particular piece of what you're mentioning, I think it's relevant here. And is that research typically shows when you look at children who are neglected versus rejected, that children who were rejected typically have the poorest outcomes, and it's much harder to recover from rejection, regardless if they change social situations, and the outcome overall, like longevity of the outcome, is usually they don't fare well, versus a child that's neglected. They can be rehabilitated and learn to connect with others. But if a child has been rejected within their own family, it's very hard to kind of learn that later on in life, and have a successful outcome in doing that.
Yeah, that's very interesting research, and it makes sense. Looking at the scapegoat's outcome, how the scapegoat is so often addicted to something. They can get involved in crime, they get very self-sabotaging. So I can see how that bears out. The scapegoat, it has intense self-loathing because of that
Yeah.
rejection that you're describing. It has terrible effect on their life and all the areas of their
Mhm.
life.
Yeah,
Mhm.
and so just taking a look at that, and you felt like which role were you? You were the scapegoat and the
Mhm.
and
Yeah, it's interesting. I think probably when I was very young, I was the lost child. I was always getting lost in books, very
Oh,
ignored. I was a
yes.
good girl. I did well at school, but nobody
Yeah.
really noticed me.
Yeah.
And then as I came into high school and started to get into drinking and
Yeah.
becoming more of a problem child because of the terrible home life I was in, I quickly became the scapegoat. And that was
Mhm.
where, I really noticed, especially my father, instead of trying to help me or empathize with me, it was very much, what's wrong with you?
Mhm.
And that kind of stayed with me until I got married. And even while I was in a relationship with someone who was the hero in his own dysfunctional family.
Mm.
So I think by association with him, I ended up marrying him. He grew a very successful business. And
Yeah.
as some people, yourself included, might know, money can hide a lot of dysfunction.
Yes.
And I had two beautiful children. We had this kind of cookie cutter life. And so I think by virtue of that, I kind of started to inhabit the hero role in my parents' eyes during that time period because of my
Mm.
relationship with my ex-husband, right?
Ah.
Then after the divorce, I went straight back into the scapegoat role again because I wasn't serving the family any longer as a hero, now as a divorced woman. And so I was back into the scapegoat role. So that's how it worked for me.
And that's also very interesting too, in terms of cycling through these roles and how circumstances, um, I don't like the way this sounds, but how circumstances may change your worth in your family's eyes. Right. And I
Mm-hmm.
don't think people talk about that enough in terms of how maybe having money may make you more of a significance later on in life. And it's actually the show that I'm working on now in terms of brainstorming. And one of the things that happens, especially if you have parents that are narcissists or dysfunctional, you know, if they have ignored their child or rejected their child, throughout that child's life, but when they become elderly, right, or sickly, they have a desire to want to reconnect because they need to be taken care of.
Mm.
And you see that when the child acquires a certain lifestyle or financial means, such as what you're
Mm-hmm.
describing.
Yeah.
I want to know from your perspective, what's it like to think about something like that?
That's interesting because what came to mind when you said that was I take Lyft wherever I go, the driving service, and I often have the best conversations with my Lyft drivers. And we were talking about Justin Bieber and how his father re-entered his life after he became famous, even though
Mm.
he'd been absent pretty much the whole time.
Mhm.
So I just thought of that when you said about people re-entering your life or maybe finding you more useful when you have more
Yeah.
resources and more means. So yeah, that came to my mind as well. And sadly, I think I noticed that with myself too. I noticed that especially with my father, because more recently I was trying to kind of get to the bottom of what's going on with my father. Why does he dislike me so much? And why does he feel the need to refuse me any empathy, that kind of thing. And I realized that, you know, me being in that marriage was useful for him because it gave him, he's very isolated himself, and it gave him kind of a social life. It gave him his family. And he said to me that, well, when you got divorced, you broke up the family. And that statement clarified everything for me. I realized
Mm.
that, oh, it didn't work for you, like this was inconvenient for you. And so you had to demonize me. And even though it's painful, the clarity is worth a lot, you know.
Mm. So now that you're back in the role of the scapegoat, what do you do as far as your own coping and healing with the current role that you're in now with your family of origin?
Yeah. So for me, what I had to really do was define myself outside of what my family said about me. And that was not an overnight thing. That took a tremendous amount of work. And that work is ongoing, to be honest with you. So it
Mm-hmm.
was really about turning the lens toward myself. You know, I think there's a Buddhist phrase that says the way out is in. So it was to stop looking to my family for validation, which I finally realized was completely futile, and to just turn it onto myself and find a way to give myself all the things that I never received as a child, as a daughter, as a wife. And for me, that's been the way. And the thing about being the scapegoat is it's interesting because a lot of my clients have been in the scapegoat role.
Mm-hmm.
And when you meet someone who's a scapegoat, they are so likable, they are so intelligent, they're so insightful. You wonder how anybody could ever dislike this person. But the thing is, the family brings out the worst in you because of the gaslighting and the blame and the shame. You end up behaving in ways that aren't really characteristic of you, in ways that other people would really probably never believe that you would behave. So they see a different side of you, and you have to begin to see yourself in a new light. And maybe even if you have people in your life that you trust, you can ask them, what do you like about me? You know, and start to take note of those things.
Mm-hmm. Do you feel like people in those roles, especially the scapegoat, sabotage themselves in their life? How
Yeah,
does that
absolutely.
sabotage show up?
Yeah, it shows up in so many ways. You know, there is one that came to mind when you said that is procrastination,
Mm,
and that is not being able to follow through on your
mhm,
goals and your plans.
mhm,
And that was a really big one for me. And that's
mhm,
something I had to learn about, you know, why I don't do that. And it's complete self sabotage. It is some fear, again, of visibility, because you've learned that visibility is dangerous. It's fear that, you know, you'll be noticed, because if you follow through on something and it's a success, you're going to be noticed, and you put yourself up for criticism, you know, and so all those things can feel very dangerous. So procrastination, not following through on plans, is definitely one of the ways that the
mm.
scapegoat harms themselves. Another one is addiction, like we already talked
Yeah,
about. So that's a really big one, because the pain is so great, and the scapegoat often feels like they have no one to turn to.
wow.
And so the only way they can regulate themselves, because it is exhausting to feel so unsupported, to feel like you're always defending yourself against attacks. The hypervigilance is so taxing on the nervous system that your addiction sometimes is the only way you can get any relief. And I
Mm,
remember feeling like that at the end of the day, taking that first drink and feeling like I can finally put my shoulders down, because they've been up around my ears proverbially all day, you know?
mm. Wow, wow, just wow, that's a lot. And that's pretty intense. When it comes to your own sort of recovery, can you talk a little bit about what that's been like? Like, what were the tools that you used to sort of provide guidance and help you along the way?
Hmm. Well, when I very first got into recovery, it was a 12-step program.
Uh-huh.
And I like to nuance that. by saying I'm neutral on 12-step programs. I'm neither a proponent or a detractor.
Mm.
It did help me, but I really want to warn women who go into 12-step programs that there are predators in those rooms and to be very mindful of protecting yourself.
Mm-hmm.
So I would say make sure, especially in your first year, to stick with the women and be very strict about that. But otherwise, the precepts of the 12-step program really helped me, especially the getting honest with yourself, the humility piece, the letting other people support you. Like it's a place where it's a no judgment zone, people are there to support each other. And, if you come from a tough family like I did, a dysfunctional family, you may not be used to leaning on other people for support. And so just being allowed to do that is really huge. I would say just focusing on myself and my recovery during that early time.
Okay.
That really is what did it. And it was making a decision to surrender as well, to not be as controlling as I had been, to not feel like I had to do everything, and to, whatever your belief system is, I believe in God. So to let God kind of take control. But some people call it the universe, whatever it is to you, just to believe in something bigger than yourself can be a big help as well. I'll also say that after the first year, and especially after a couple of years in the 12-step program, I started to feel like I needed more personal growth, because there is an aspect of it that kind of keeps you in the same place. They insist that you continue to call yourself an alcoholic or an addict, for example, and I no longer felt comfortable with that after 2+ years. Now I'm 12 years, but after 2+ years, I didn't want to keep saying I was an alcoholic. I wanted to envision something new for myself. So I just there's that caveat about the 12-step that I owe them my life, I feel, in many ways, but in other ways, I have those healthy criticisms about it too.
Nice. Well, it's good that you were able to recover from that. As you've worked through your recovery through alcoholism, but it sounds like you still are a part of your family of origin.
Yeah, you know what? To be honest, I'm really not. I'm very
Okay.
detached from my family of origin.
Okay.
But the funny thing is, there might be people in my family that don't realize that, because I was kind of already detached from them, if that makes sense. And my father was sort of the most recent one, as I was just saying, hearing him say that I was no longer useful because I got a divorce, and not in those words, but that's what I kind of got from it. And in fact, the last time I saw him, I asked him if he wanted a relationship with me, and he said no. So that was sort of the end of that. I mean, I'm always open to things can change. I'm very open to that. I don't shut the door on these relationships, but at the same time, my needs have to come first,
Absolutely.
and my health and my recovery has to come first. And I can't allow people, even if they're in my family, to treat me less than I deserve, right?
I'm sorry to hear that. I know that that must have been very hurtful. Even if someone can be a certain way, right? Like even if Ebenezer Scrooge is Ebenezer Scrooge, it still hurts to hear that to a certain extent. My question for you is, as a woman that has been rejected by her father, um, how does that show up in your relationship with men?
Yeah, well, it always showed up as me wanting people who were hard to get, emotionally unavailable, as they say.
Mm-hmm.
I married someone who was extremely emotionally unavailable. Just like my father, he provided for me. materially he gave me what I needed, but emotionally there was absolutely nothing there. And I realize now that that wasn't his fault. That was, the product of him and his own dysfunctional family, right? The role that he was in didn't allow for intimacy with others. So I would say that I have tended to move toward men who cannot give me what I need. And, through all this self-discovery, I've seen that's also because I've been emotionally unavailable. So it's sort of like putting it on someone else, but at the same time, I'm assuring that I don't have to enter into that intimacy, right? Mhm.
Has that been able to autocorrect since you've detached?
Yeah, well, detaching from my father has been a very recent occurrence.
Okay.
So I can feel the difference inside,
Yes.
and I can sense myself not being willing to go into another partnership with someone who can't give me what I need. But I haven't tested that out yet. Like, I'm dating, but I haven't had the opportunity to truly test it out,
Okay. Okay. So the training wheels are on and you're trying
That's
it
it.
out. What are some of the like the differences that you now feel inside now that you've detached from and you're cognizant, right? Because I think that's also the biggest piece is being aware that like there's a part of me that was very emotionally unavailable and I'm attracting these emotionally unavailable people. So what have you noticed that's changed inside or maybe that you're a lot more intentional about?
Yeah, a huge one. I'm sure some of your listeners will relate to this. A huge one is not seeing red flags as challenges. Red
Mm.
flags are not challenges. Those are those are stop signs. That means turn around, and let that one go. So just heeding the red flags, really saying, what do I want instead of what does the other person want?
Yes.
And realizing how subconscious that was, that I would try to
Mhm.
meet other people's needs instead of asking, what do I need? And kind of twist myself to try and get them on side and all that stuff. It was very
Yeah.
manipulative at times and on my
Yeah.
part.
Yeah.
And so now just being, completely honest about who I am and what I really, really want. And like I said, heeding those red flags and not seeing them as hurdles to overcome.
Can you go back to the part where you were manipulative? Can you say more about that?
Yeah, I think that comes from trying to figure out what somebody else wants and giving it to them. So instead of being your true self, you'll figure out, oh, well, they like this. So let me show them that, so they'll like me. And then what happens is that you might get into a relationship with this person, and just like the emotions that have to come out, your real self, your true character is going to come out at some point, and it's going to contradict what you've been presenting as your fine self.
Like, who in the
So I
hell is
think,
that?
right. Yeah. So I think that's a good example.
I think that's an example, but I also think that that's something that's very common. Again, when we're hiding ourselves, we try to mold and shape ourselves to something that's or someone that's much more palatable for that other person. Like, oh, I'm going to be what you like instead of showing up as my authentic self. Like, oh, you like shoes? Well, let me become a shoe. Just for an
Yeah.
example, like, let me just become everything that person wants. And then if you start to show your true self and things don't work out, it kind of feeds into
Mm-hmm.
that old narrative. They rejected me for being myself. Mm,
Yeah, absolutely. And
mm,
guess where we learned that? We learned that we had to be something else to be accepted, to be loved. And so we don't ever feel like it might feel impossible that somebody would ever love you for who you are. That might feel
mhm.
just like that's not possible for me. And that's why we do that dance. We do that.
Yeah.
How can I twist myself to become what this person wants?
Yeah. Impossible or that you're unlovable, or that, another common one I hear is like, maybe God forgot about me, because especially for a lot of women, God takes on the role of the father, right? Another
Mhm.
male figure who has that power to make those decisions over your worth. And so,
Yeah.
yeah, that just comes out in a number of ways.
Yeah.
Well, this has been such an awesome learning experience, and taking me back to my research days.
That's fantastic.
And just, thinking about all the themes that do come up in dysfunctional family. Laura, if the listeners would love to connect with you or continue a conversation with you, where can they find you? And are you working on anything else? You mentioned your book and the coaching program. Anything else we can support you with?
Sure. So the best place to find me would be on Instagram, and that's at Laura K. Connell. And if you go to my bio, there's 3 ways to connect with me. One is free, and it's a quiz on dysfunctional family roles. So you can
Mm,
go find out yours. The next is a low price course I offer on reparenting yourself. And more of an investment would be one-to-one coaching with me.
yeah.
Something I have coming up is an online retreat. I did my first one last year and it was
Oh,
very
nice.
successful. So I decided to do another one, and that's at the end of
Amazing.
February, the 21st to the 23rd. And it's called Dysfunctional Family Detox.
Oh, love it. Well, thank you so much for being a guest on the show. I thoroughly enjoy talking to you.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure. I really enjoyed it too.
Awesome. Okay, would love to know what your thoughts are. You know the drill. If you're on YouTube or social media, drop those comments and let me know how you felt about what we talked about today. Could you relate to it? Did you see some of these themes in your family? Were you the person that was the scapegoat, the golden child, or any of the enabler, the rescuer, or any of those types of people? Who were you in your family? And let me know if you are still that person, or if you were like Laura, you evolved through cycles, or you the lost child at some point. Would love to hear your thoughts. And until next time, you guys take care of yourselves and be well.